I know that you've also spoken about, your status as a father and your experience that you've had raising your children. And, you've talked about having, male and female children. And surprise, surprise, the experience doing that is a bit different for them. So I'm kind of curious, just basically, what your experience has really been, how you integrate these libertarian principles into it, and just what advice you would give people who are trying to raise children, who are essentially new to being parents.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So I have four children, ages 1 through 7. My youngest is the girl. So I actually know the least about raising girls. And to be honest with you, raising a girl is actually the most intimidating for me. It's more intimidating than raising male children. And in terms of raising your children and mixing them with your political beliefs, like I do want to propagate my values, but I actually don't see my libertarian values as, and I differ from a lot of libertarians here, I see them as at least somewhat of a personal preference rather than objectively correct. Like I can give you the objectively correct arguments, and I'm not going to say that my brain doesn't think that they're true, but other people have all these arguments for their beliefs, so to me, like I would love my kids, if they were socialists or whatever. I wouldn't want them to live in New Hampshire, but I would love them nonetheless. And so in terms of raising your kid, so how do my beliefs influence raising my kids? I mean, I give my kids a lot of trust, a lot of leeway. I try to let them make their own mistakes. If they tell me that they think they can do something, I try to trust them in that, even if it makes me a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit nervous, at least within a wide domain of things. Like, if my kid says, I want to put my fork in the electrical outlet, obviously you're not going to trust them on literally everything. But there's a whole set of things, I certainly like going to the playground and this kind of thing where, I watch some other parents and they're clearly, more concerned, more timid, more trepidatious with what they let their children do. And, I'm like, hey, if you think you can jump off of that, you can jump off of that. I think one of the tests that I use is if a risk is sort of within their evolutionary bounds, their evolutionary experience, like kids have been jumping off of stuff for, since before we were humans, right? Like when proto-humans jumped off of stuff. We have a lot of training there to be able to judge whether we can jump off of something, right? We don't have training about whether we can. With electricity is something we don't have evolutionary experience to. So I tend to use this as a test. So like things inside the set of like we've experienced this for a long time. I tend to trust my children's judgment substantially. I might watch them. I might be there for. I might warn them. I might explain, hey, this would be dangerous or whatever. But I let my 5 and my 7-year-old. They start fires. They have axes to chop wood, which they love doing. They just like to take the axes and go out. And we don't even have a fireplace. I let my kids, they go out in the backyard and there's like, can we start a fire? I'm like, sure, go ahead. And the first couple of times I watched them, to make sure. And once they've done it a couple of times, they have a set of procedures. They say, hey, you've got to have water nearby. These are the safety procedures and you have to follow them. But I trust them. My 7-year-old, and I try to encourage, I think, and this is also partially motivated by my own experience from being a child, where I often felt that a lot of adults, although not my parents notably, my parents, I think, parented me in a way relatively similar to the way that I'm parenting my children. In fact, if anything, I'm actually stricter than my parents. But other adults, wanted to treat me like a child when I felt that I ought not to be treated that way. And so I actually remember vowing all the way back to being a child that I wouldn't do that to others as I've grown up. And so that comes to both how I raise my own kids, how I interact with other kids, and it comes to how I interact with even young adults. I've hired a 16-year-old and given him a full-time programming job because he was a 16-year-old who could do a full-time programming job. And so I try to and also, by the way, a smart 7-year-old does just as well in a standardized math test as like a 30th percentile 18-year-old. Okay, so we also, I think, part of we don't always recognize or appreciate how bright and talented at least some kids can be. And I'm not even saying all of my kids are at that level or whatever. I don't even know yet. I haven't given them a standardized test, but this is objectively true. Like a 99th percentile 7-year-old is like very close to average on math as like an 18-year-old, which is like kind of shocking. But it appears to be. Maybe it's not 50th percent; it might be like 30th percentile or something, or a little bit lower. But it's like it's much closer than you might guess. And so I try to treat children that way. And by the way, a 5-year-old's brain is 90 to 95% fully developed.
Right.
They obviously have a ton of training to go through. And then there's a pruning phase that happens neurologically in puberty. But in terms of brain volume and brain size and neurons, this is why when kids turn 5, it's such a breakthrough for people who aren't parents that might not know this. But like generally, like when your kids turn around 5, you find that your child is all of a sudden like capable in all these ways that they weren't before, and that's because their brain is basically full size, is near full size in terms of the amount of neurons and connections that will exist within the brain. And so that brain has undergone very little training. It has a lot to learn about the world, but it is not like the brain is not growing that much from that point on. Maybe it grows like another like 10% in volume or something like this from 5 all the way through puberty. So I think our society has become sort of very infantilized, and I try to be the opposite of that. One other thing I'll say here, I've been talking for a while on this already, though, is that if you nerd out on what impacts child outcomes, if you try to really consult like good studies and good analysis of what matters, one of the things that appears to matter an incredible amount, arguably, I actually think there's some decent evidence that this single decision weighs more than every other decision you'll make as a parent combined. And this is, what is the peer group that your child is embedded within? So what's the shared community of your child? Because so many of the influences on your children come from outside the household. They come from their peers. They come from their school. They come from the other adults that they interact with. And this was actually a big impetus in me moving to New Hampshire and choosing to raise my children in New Hampshire. I came from Philadelphia. That's where I was living. Maybe it was a little bit libertarian-ish, but a lot of the people were progressives, like kind of the better form of progressives. Like they were tech people, they were smart people, but they were liberals, and they were a little bit neurotic by my standards. And it just wasn't. They weren't people that I wanted to raise my children around, even though I liked them, actually. I disagreed with them on some political issues, but I did like them. But it wasn't the community to raise my kids. Whereas here in New Hampshire, although I'm not literally in New Hampshire right now, the community for raising your kids is amazing. So literally last week, my kids went to a farm and participated in the processing of chickens. So they helped slaughter chickens. They helped do all the steps that get a chicken, ready to be eaten. You defeather it and you do all these steps. I actually know very little about this, but I think it's so cool that the farm owner, who's also a free stater, invites children out to learn about this. He does firearms lessons for kids. He lets kids learn to weld. At Pork Fest last year, he did a motorcycle teardown. A motorcycle engine teardown, a 2-stroke engine teardown for children, and they spent like an hour or two taking apart the engine, learning about all the parts and this kind of thing. And I think this is like so healthy for kids to be experiencing. And the other parents that I'm around, if my kid jumps off something that like even in my own head I'm like, is he gonna be okay here? Like people are okay with it, and no one's gonna like look at me weird and this kind of thing. So I think that's so big that they're getting reinforcement of these values, not just from me, but from everyone around them. And I think that is actually one of the single best reasons for libertarians to live in New Hampshire is the community that's available for raising your kids, because there's this whole network of schools, there's thousands of parents, there's these homeschooling networks and this kind of thing. And so there's really nothing else like it anywhere in the country.
Going off of in regards to what you were saying about peer groups as well, the importance of that, I do think that even as adults, there's still it can still be challenging to resist the mob mentality that often takes place. I do believe that people often go along with the thoughts that they see simply because they're seeing other people come along with those thoughts. I think that there is some type of psychological phenomena where people think, well, there's all of them and there's only one of me. Who am I to disagree?
This
But
is a
as
huge,
far
yeah.
as children, it seems as though there's some influence of, the respecting of private property, at least, you know, and as we often know, children can sometimes have a challenging time understanding this concept of, private property. But do you think that as a parent, you've put any more emphasis on this concept than somebody who was of a different belief system would have?
Probably. We definitely talk about, are these things, your property? What are your rights to interact with these things? And in terms of inside of my own household, we have a concept of, is this family property or this is a communist term, but is it personal property? Is it, but this is how we handle it, right? Like, because you have kids, you don't want each toy to be owned by a child. So we have family property. Family property has its own rules, but my children do have their own personal property. And so their personal property has to be stored upstairs in their bedroom. They have shelves in places that their property belongs, and the other children can't take their property or touch their property without asking the owner of that property. Family property has different rules, in terms of how it has to get shared and how it can be accessed and this kind of thing. And of course, there are things that are dad's property or mom's property or parents' property. But we certainly talk about property regularly. I think my children could explain that relatively decently.